This exactly marks the difference between Colonel Hamilton's views and mine, that I would wish the debt paid tomorrow. He wishes it never to be paid, but always to be a thing wherewith to corrupt and manage the legislature. This slapback from Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson was aimed squarely at Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton. These two, along with Edmund Randolph and Henry Knox, made up George Washington's first cabinet. In this episode, we're going to explain the process of how all of this went down right at the beginning of the government under the Constitution, plus some of the major ideological debates and disputes, issues like the national debt, and also the first national bank, which was a real big one, which created a rift so deep that it helped give rise to America's first two-party system. First of all, before getting to that, welcome and thank you for joining me here on the Path to Liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Friday, November 15th, 2024. That quote right off the bat was from Thomas Jefferson in a letter to George Washington. He was responding to the fact that, Hamilton was anonymously publishing attacks on Jefferson in the press. So this was really kind of spilling out. It wasn't just in their meetings and conversations. It was spilling out into the public. But anyways, here from the National Archives, they point out that early in his tenure as Secretary of State, Jefferson began to preserve his reactions to national events. He recorded discussions in and out of government, gossiped about his political enemies, and documented his growing suspicion that Treasury Secretary Hamilton was employing corrupt means to steer the American Republic in a more monarchical and elitist direction. In these ragged, rubbed, and scribbled scraps, Jefferson expressed his frustration that President Washington did not share his mistrust of Hamilton, scorn for Secretary of War Henry Knox, and irritation that Attorney General Edmund Randolph did not always support him in the cabinet. Randolph kind of tried to play middle of the road. I don't think Knox was as much involved in some of the debates, especially Hamilton and Madison. Now, reading through this, because Jefferson, about a decade later, he took all these scraps and notes and he had the full collection bound up into 3 volumes. Randolph later called them the Anas, which is really basically means table talk or anecdotes. And if you read through it, we'll link to it in the show notes so you have the full original source document. You can see firsthand the nasty infighting and the growth of party politics on both sides of this. And I think it's really actually just very interesting. Now, President Washington's cabinet, as mentioned, was just 4 members and compared to what we have today, much smaller. And it was intended on purpose to be diverse, but regionally, because we're talking about a union of states, independent sovereign states, and very big regional differences. Even though we think that all the founders were just one unique blob, they were very, very different in their modes and habits and their politics, their religious sentiments, their economic views, and the like. We had Knox from New England. The Middle Atlantic was Hamilton, and then 2 Southerners were Jefferson and Randolph. They weren't all his first choice. People might think that, he just picked who he wanted and he just will roll right through it, but that's not how it went down. First of all, for a little background, we're looking at the Constitution, Article 2, Section 2. The president shall nominate and by and with the advice and consent of the Senate shall appoint ambassadors, other public ministers and consuls, judges of the Supreme Court, and all other officers of the United States whose appointments are not herein otherwise provided for, and which shall be established by law. That's the text in the Constitution for the United States. And on May 19th, Representative James Madison, father of the Constitution, introduced a resolution to create 3 departments, May 19, 1789. Resolved that it is the opinion of this committee there should be established for the aid of the chief magistrate in executing the duties of his station the following departments, to wit, a department for foreign affairs. That became Secretary of State, at the head of which shall be an officer called the Secretary of the United States for Foreign Affairs. That there should be a Department of the Treasury, at the head of which shall be, etc., and a Department of War, at the head of which, and etc., to be nominated by the president and appointed by him with the advice and consent of the Senate and removable by the president. There was some pretty heavy debate about the removal power. That went on for about 5-6 days. But James Madison wrote to Thomas Jefferson about this, discussing this, how, well, who was kind of vying for these roles. He said, "It is already agreed in the form of resolutions that there shall be 3 departments, one for finance, another for foreign affairs, and the third for war. The last will be continued in the hands of General Knox, who had the similar role under the Articles of Confederation. The second will remain with Mr. Jay, John Jay, who ended up being the first Chief Justice, if he chooses to keep it. Also a carryover from the Articles of Confederation. The Chancellor, this is Robert Livingston of New York, he wishes this department, the third, but will not succeed the Finance Department, the first that Madison mentioned. It will be given, I think, to Jay or Hamilton. The latter is perhaps best qualified for that species of business, and on that account would be preferred by those who know him personally. He wrote, it says latter here in the text, but he crossed it off later and said the former. He meant Jay. The former is more known by character throughout the United States. So he's basically saying he's expecting the head of finance, Secretary of the Treasury, to be John Jay or Hamilton. John Jay might stay as a Secretary of Foreign Affairs, and everyone knew that General Knox was going to be the main guy, the head of the Secretary of War. Well, they eventually created these departments. Department of Foreign Affairs, this was on July 27th, 1789, a War Department on August 7th, and then the Treasury Department on September 2nd. And let's kick it off, first of all, with a list of the Secretaries of State of the United States. Under the Articles of Confederation, the precursor to the Secretary of State was called the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, as Madison was mentioned. Robert Livingston was the first guy there from October of 1781 through early June of 1783. Then John Jay came in, and he had the role for about 5 years. From 1784 through 1789, and then he retained that role. He remained in the position even after they renamed it the Secretary of State under the Constitution. He was basically there in an interim role. Now, Jay, of course, actually very famously helped negotiate the Treaty of Paris, 1783, with Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, which officially ended the war for independence with Britain. And here's one of his takes. You don't see a Secretary of State take these types of positions these days. He said, "While there are knaves and fools in the world, there will be wars in it." That's in his letter to Gouverneur Morris just in the weeks following the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783. Now, John Jay was also George Washington's first choice. He offered him the job of Secretary of State. He thought this was going to be the guy. But Jay actually wanted to be on the Supreme Court. He did not want to be the head of Treasury Department, the Secretary of the Treasury either. So he told Washington that he would stay on an interim basis because, well, eventually they nominated somebody else. But here's another take on foreign policy, war powers under the Constitution from John Jay. He said, "Until war is constitutionally declared, the nation and all its members must observe and preserve peace." Now, we're going to get to his replacement here in just a few. Of course, that's Thomas Jefferson. But regarding the Treasury Department, we know that the Chancellor, Robert Livingston, wanted the job. He was vying for it. Hamilton was lobbying aggressively to try to get the job as well. He really, really wanted it as well. But here from the Lehrman Institute, the article, or it might be a book, Founding Economists, George Washington initially approached Pennsylvania's Robert Morris, who directed the America's finances during the Revolutionary War and also helped finance Albert Gallatin's early land purchases. But Morris also declined to take this post, arguing, quote, and I have not found the original source document on this. I know it's in Cherno's book on Hamilton, so we'll take this one with a grain of salt. I just haven't found it. Maybe somebody else knows the exact original source, but supposedly Morris said, quote, "You will be no loser by my declining the secretaryship of the Treasury, for I can recommend to you a far cleverer fellow." What a great way to describe it. "A far cleverer fellow than I am for your Minister of Finance, in the person of your former aide-de-camp, Colonel Hamilton." Now, here from George Washington's Mount Vernon, they point out that at first, Washington hesitated to appoint Hamilton. Man, the idea of going with your gut instinct, I wish he would have really done it on this one. He hesitated to appoint Hamilton because of his polarizing personality, but eventually decided on his appointment because of Hamilton's financial expertise. So on the other September 11th, 1789, President Washington made his first of these cabinet nominations. He said, "Gentlemen of the Senate, I nominate for the Department of the Treasury of the United States, Alexander Hamilton of New York, Secretary." Then, of course, he also nominated people for kind of underling roles, comptroller, treasurer, auditor, register. But for the Department of War, Henry Knox. And you might be surprised to know, because Hamilton was really kind of a flip-flopper, a wolf in sheep's clothing, but you didn't know that until, well, things went down in the coming years, because he sounded much more like someone who is really into a strict reading of the Constitution during the ratification debates in some areas of the Federalists as well, but especially in the New York Ratifying Convention. He really sold it hard about how the federal government would only have those powers expressly delegated to it. But the way he tried to apply that in the years to come certainly changed. He was confirmed so Washington sent this to the Senate. They got his nominations and they confirmed unanimously Alexander Hamilton. The way that the story is told, at least what I've read, it just took them minutes, total unanimous. And this also included some leading anti-federalists who were in the Senate, like Richard Henry Lee and William Grayson of Virginia. Both senators from Virginia were very, very ardent anti-federalists during the ratification debates, and they all voted yes. Henry Knox was approved by the Senate the following day on September 12th. Now let's get through some of here's a good one from Hamilton. Here he is opposing paper money. He said, "To emit an unfunded paper as the sign of value ought not to continue a formal part of the Constitution, nor ever hereafter to be employed." Unfunded paper, he was totally against it. Not totally against paper money, but in that situation, he said, "Being in its nature pregnant with abuses and liable to be made the engine of imposition and fraud, holding out temptations equally pernicious to the integrity of government and to the morals of the people." I thought that was a pretty good one to include here. Now, one thing that Hamilton was well known for, very famous for when it comes to his economic views, and maybe he was also despised for this to some degree as well. And this was a position that he took under the Articles of Confederation all the way back to 1783-ish. This was actually 1781, this next one here, is that he actually was in favor of debt. He liked it and saw it as a tool. But as you heard right at the beginning, Jefferson pointed out this was a problem. Hamilton, of course, liked it. The way he describes it, his caveat sounds pretty good, but in essence, it is, I think, how Jefferson described it. He saw debt as a way to manage the legislature. Anyways, this is Hamilton to Robert Morris. He said, "A national debt, if it is not excessive, will be to us a national blessing. It will be powerful cement of our union. But here, check this out. It will also create a necessity for keeping up taxation to a degree which, without being oppressive, will be a spur to industry." This is kind of from the mercantilist mentality of old, rather than a free market Adam Smith thinking, at least for them, that was more new at the time. And he really felt that the more if you had a certain level of taxation and a certain amount of debt, you could actually manage things and then create a really strong economy. And maybe there is an argument to say that kind of top-down structure helped get the U.S. out of the very difficult financial situation it was early on, but it also established the precedent that government was going to keep expanding over time, especially when you start including the national bank, because Hamilton was the guy who not only gave us the first national bank, and which was the precursor to the second, and then, of course, to the Federal Reserve, all the same arguments constitutionally behind these things. But he also gave us the whiskey tax, which led to all kinds of conflict and resistance. And he also started the process of redefining terms under the Constitution, most famously for Hamilton in his arguments in support of establishing a national bank. He said that the word necessary in the necessary and proper clause merely meant convenient. And there certainly is an argument that we'll get to on that in just a little bit. Now, I want to first get to Secretary of War Henry Knox, who was also confirmed right off the bat. This is just a day after Hamilton. I'm not sure if it was unanimous. I'm assuming all of these were unanimous, but I don't know. But Knox, on the very positive side, was a big supporter of a militia instead of a standing army. He was in favor of the people themselves being at least the first line of defense. And a standing army was not something that you have in a free society. He said an energetic national militia is to be regarded as the capital security of a free republic and not a standing army forming a distinct class in the community. And the way that you have an energetic national militia is that everyone is really part of that militia. We know that's how the founders looked at it. And those people are well trained and well armed at all times. So a very highly armed population was the view of Henry Knox. He also favored peace with the Indian tribes and a very, very strict, I should have actually had a link to this to include in the show notes. If I remember after the show's done, I'll try to. But he had a very strict view of war powers under the Constitution, even against the Indian nations who had declared war on the United States, were doing incursions. He and George Washington agreed, along with Hamilton and Jefferson. They had some concurrence on war powers, at least at this time, that they couldn't do any offensive measures. All they could do was up to the border and then repel attacks. Anything beyond that required approval from the part of the government which was empowered to make decisions over war and peace, and that was Congress. Anyways, here he is in his report on Indian affairs in December of 1794. It seems that our own experience would demonstrate the propriety of endeavoring to preserve a pacific conduct, in other words, peaceful conduct, in preference to a hostile one with the Indian tribes. They wanted to establish peace. Now, whether they went about it in a really great way or not, I guess that's debatable. But you can see from a lot of the writings here what they were looking towards and some of the kind of terrible truths. Here's General Knox. It is a melancholy reflection that our modes of population have been more destructive to the Indian natives than the conduct of the conquerors of Mexico and Peru. The evidence of this is the utter extirpation of nearly all the Indians in most populous parts of the Union. I thought that was interesting to include from Henry Knox in 1794. Now let's get back to the next nominations. On September 25th, 1789, George Washington to the United States Senate. I nominate Thomas Jefferson for Secretary of State and Edmund Randolph for Attorney General. We know, of course, that he did not get his first choice, Robert Morris, for Secretary of the Treasury. He also didn't get his first choice, John Jay, for Secretary of State. It'd be interesting to see how their views may have aligned. John Jay, of course, I think in many ways was closer to a Hamiltonian than to a Jeffersonian, but he certainly was not kind of the extreme, really. He was not Hamilton. Both of these guys, Randolph first said, "Oh, man, I'm pretty busy here in the Virginia legislature. We're debating the Bill of Rights, Patrick Henry, or the amendments to the Constitution. They weren't calling it the Bill of Rights yet. Patrick Henry was working to kind of, do some other stuff. And there was a lot of back and forth. He's like, I got to get some stuff done before I can do this. And Washington said, you got to do what you got to do, but I really think you're the guy for the job. So I hope you will take it. So he hesitated to take the job. Thomas Jefferson was the minister in France. He was Benjamin Franklin's, not a replacement, his follow-up. He wouldn't have even considered himself equal to the task of Benjamin Franklin. But he also said, I kind of done a lot of work here. Thank you for the nomination. The way Washington did this, because we're talking about recess appointments as well on this, Washington went through the nomination process for people who weren't around and then asked them afterwards. And then he was thinking, if they don't accept, they've already been confirmed because Congress is in session. Then in that situation, then there's a recess appointment needed, and I can come up with a backup. So he reached out to Thomas Jefferson, wrote to him in France. This was a little bit longer back and forth, of course. And Jefferson was approved as well on September 26th, same day as Edmund Randolph, the very day after they were nominated by President Washington. And he's like, I kind of like how things are. I've got some work that I've been doing. But if you really, really want me to do it, I will definitely drop everything. In essence, this is me just kind of paraphrasing some of the back and forth in a number of letters. And Washington pressed him and convinced both of them to join up, and they both said yes. Now, Edmund Randolph was a top legal mind of the time. He's one of the guys who actually was responsible for drafting the necessary and proper clause at the Philadelphia Convention. Now, he made some really interesting arguments about how, well, it is nowhere close to how we describe it today, but as a legal mind, he was able to explain it to people back then. That might make for another episode. A quick one on Edmund Randolph's view of the necessary and proper clause, but he issued a number of important opinions as Attorney General. Here, for one, is his opinion on recess appointments, which is still debated to this day, whether it's important or not. I think it certainly is, because it also shows one of the framers of the Constitution, along with George Washington, one of the framers of the Constitution from Philadelphia, one of the top legal guys who drafted parts of it, and one of the leading advocates for the Constitution. Even though he didn't sign it first, he flipped the switch during the Virginia Ratifying Convention, the first AG, the first administration. His view on recess appointments, I think, is pretty important, whether you agree with it or not. And here's how he put it. He said, the spirit of the Constitution favors the participation of the Senate in all appointments. But as it may be necessary oftentimes to fill up vacancies, when it may be inconvenient to summon the Senate, a temporary commission may be granted by the president. This power then is to be considered as an exception to the general participation of the Senate. It ought to be interpreted strictly. In other words, you got to have a really good reason. This was about Chief Coiner, and he actually was saying, you can't even do this. I suggest that you read this in full so you can understand the context on your own time. It will be linked to in the show notes. Alan Mosley does an awesome job organizing a blog post for every single episode, and I get it published a couple of hours after the live stream is done over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. And all these original source documents and stuff that I'm citing for this episode will be included in the show links section as you scroll down that blog post a little bit. Again, so you can read and learn more in context on your own time. So Randolph's opinion, first AG on recess appointments. Now, after Congress passed Alexander Hamilton's proposal to establish a national bank in early 1791, George Washington asked his AG, that's Randolph, to prepare an opinion on whether or not this was constitutional. And here from Mike Meharry's article on this, in Randolph's view, the central constitutional question surrounding the bank was whether the federal government was delegated the power of incorporation. If it's not there, you gotta, here's how Randolph put it. It must be acknowledged that if any part of the bill does either encounter the Constitution or is not warranted by it, the clause of incorporation is the only one. Is the federal government delegated a power to incorporate a bank? Randolph asserted, quote, that the power of creating corporations is not expressly given to Congress is obvious. In other words, read the text. We don't see anything delegated to the federal government, to Congress, to anybody to create a corporation in the Constitution. It just doesn't exist. Going further, Meharry says, that being the case, there were then only three ways the federal government could legitimately exercise the power to charter a corporation. And this is from Randolph. First, because the nature of the federal government implies it. So one argument would be, do they have all kinds of implied power? Two, because it is involved in some of the specified powers of legislation. So is it part of one of the expressly delegated powers? Or three, is it, and here's the guy, he understands what necessary and proper means, because it is necessary and proper to carry into execution some of the specified powers. Now, he's not saying that these are legitimate ways. He's the kind of guy that would go through the legal arguments that anyone else would make. And certainly he understood the legal arguments that were being made in support of the national bank. And he went through all three of these, and he proceeded to pretty quickly and pretty handily dismantle all three of those arguments. I covered that in some detail in an episode earlier this year, the Constitution versus the National Bank. Edmund Randolph's analysis. I hope you'll check that out. It'll be linked to in the show notes. Again, that's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Now let's get to Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, who took over for John Jay, the interim Secretary of Foreign Affairs, then Secretary of State. I believe Jefferson started somewhere around March of 1790, maybe March 25th or so. Now, Jefferson, in the role of Secretary of State, it had more of a domestic and foreign thing. That's why they didn't just call it Secretary of Foreign Affairs. It was very broad. There was some complaints that the way Washington described both Treasury to Hamilton and State to Jefferson was kind of, it blew their heads up, each of them, that they were going to have all this power to do all these things. Hamilton even was referring to himself kind of like the Prime Minister of the United States. He thought he had that kind of impact, and maybe in some ways he really did. But anyways, Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson was a big supporter of a foreign policy based on peace, commerce, and trade. And of course, here from years later in his first inaugural address, he made it very clear as president that he also held that same view many years later. Peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. But more important than that, I think the big conflict that was really going down was over that national bank. Of course, the whiskey tax was a huge deal a couple of years later, but in 1791, February 15th, 10 months to the day before ratification of the Bill of Rights, Thomas Jefferson puts out, I think Washington asked him as well, his opinion on the constitutionality of that bank bill. And he started it out with a 10th Amendment argument. This was his foundation for everything. First of all, delegated versus, similar to Randolph, but is it there or not? He said, I consider the foundation of the Constitution as laid on this ground, that all powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited to the states, are reserved to the states or to the people. That was the proposed 12th Amendment became the 10th. It was the 10th that was ratified. He said, to take a single step beyond the boundaries thus specially drawn around the powers of Congress is to take possession of a boundless field of power no longer susceptible of any definition. Imagine a Secretary of State, any of them in modern times, saying the Federal Reserve shouldn't exist. The 10th Amendment tells us it definitely shouldn't. And even if you think it's just a small problem, just a single step beyond the limits of the Constitution sets a precedent for them to do basically whatever they want because they no longer have rules that they have to follow. That's the argument that Jefferson was making as Secretary of State. He continued, he said, the incorporation of a bank, just like Randolph. Are they authorized? Are they delegated expressly a power to incorporate a bank? The incorporation of a bank and other powers assumed by this bill have not, in my opinion, been delegated to the United States by the Constitution. Now, he went through the Commerce Clause argument on this, general welfare argument on this, but he really hammered home on necessary and proper because Hamilton and his team, they were pushing the idea that necessary didn't mean necessary. Necessary meant merely convenient. Years later, Chief Justice John Marshall basically hammered this home in a very famous opinion where he took many of Hamilton's views on this, even word for word in some places, and reiterated this as precedent for the Supreme Court. So this is really nasty stuff here that's living with us still to this day. Anyways, here's Jefferson taking down this necessary means convenient argument. He said, it has been much urged that a bank will give great facility or convenience in the collection of taxes. Suppose this were true. He's not even making an argument whether it is or not. That's not the question. Maybe it is more convenient. But the Constitution doesn't say you can do extra stuff because it's convenient. He says, yet the Constitution allows only the means which are necessary, not those which are merely convenient for effecting the enumerated powers. If such a latitude of construction be allowed to this phrase as to give any non-enumerated power, it will go to everyone. For there is no one which ingenuity may not torture into a convenience in some way or other, to someone of so long a list of enumerated powers. I mean, if you think about it, if you tell government you can do whatever you think is convenient, there is no limit on their power at all. And the Hamiltonian, I guess we would have to say Washington because he signed this thing, Hamilton-Washington Marshall view of necessary means convenient means government has whatever power it can get away with. That's basically what Jefferson said here. He said it would swallow up all the delegated powers and reduce the whole to one phrase as before observed. What's the point of even enumerating stuff if they can just do whatever they can torture into a convenience in basically every situation possible? Anyways, I covered that in much more detail in another episode. This is an oldie but a goodie, almost 4 years, well, more than 4 years ago. Thomas Jefferson, the Constitution versus the National Bank. Of course, the thumbnail says, and the Fed, but I think that's a really important episode as well. Now, rivalries, infighting, these things really, really ramped up. At first, I would say at least 6 to 8 months, if not a full year, there wasn't a lot of infighting. Hamilton and Jefferson talked to each other. Everybody was kind of communicating with each other. And it was, even if there were disagreements, it wasn't really, really bad. But once that bank bill came in, then, it was gloves are off. Hamilton's economic policies, which Washington really did embrace. And then we're talking the whiskey tax, the bank, both of which Washington signed. They really, really created a serious party politics problem. And here from Mount Vernon again, somehow Washington had to rein in these two men, this is Hamilton and Jefferson, and enable them to work towards some kind of common good. No easy task. In 1792, when he seems to have first realized the depth of the two men's hatred for each other, he wrote almost identical letters to them, pleading with them to try to get along. He also sent letters to Edmund Randolph and Henry Knox, basically like, hey, this stuff is spilling over into the public. It's going to break confidence in this new system that we set up. We're going to run into some problems. Chill out. Here's how he put it. This is the letter to Thomas Jefferson, August of 1792. How unfortunate and how much is it to be regretted then that whilst we are encompassed on all sides with avowed enemies and insidious friends, that internal dissensions should be harrowing and tearing our vitals. The last, to me, is the most serious, the most alarming, and the most afflicting of the two. Now, he's like, I don't want to make you feel like you're singled out. It's like a parent. You're all wrong. I had that from my parents all the time. Even if somebody else was wrong, if I got too upset, I was also wrong. We all got punished. He said, I do not mean to apply these observations or this advice to any particular person or character. I have given them in the same general terms to other officers of the government, because the disagreements which have arisen from difference of opinions and the attacks which have been made upon almost all the measures of government and most of its executive officers have for a long time past filled me with painful sensations and cannot fail, I think, of producing unhappy consequences at home and abroad. So again, he wrote similar letters to Hamilton and Randolph. I don't know, maybe he did not. My notes say he did not send one to Knox, so I don't actually recall whether that went down with Knox as well. But ultimately, this divide, this infighting, it was a big part of the creation, the growth of the first two-party. The first party system was what it's called, which really started around 1792. We have the Democratic Republican Party. This is the Jeffersonians, Madisonians. It originated in Congress to oppose the nationalist, more mercantilist, economically interventionist policies of Alexander Hamilton and the Federalist Party, which started even before that. And I think we're still living with some of the worst of this stuff today, more than 2 centuries later. And I think the lesson for us to be learned is that if even just 1/4 of your cabinet, 25% of your cabinet is pushing for all kinds of usurpations of power, twisting things out of the context of the original legal meaning, according to the founders and the ratifiers, that can do damage for centuries. Well, I really appreciate you spending some of your time with me today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you learned something. If you want to help us reach and teach more and more people with these essential history lessons, this essential foundational principles, nothing helps us do this work more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month. If you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat, please consider throwing it our way over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. You can do a one-time donation, 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. If you don't have any loot to throw our way, we'll be very grateful for anything you can contribute to support the cause. But you can also do some free things, very easy things to help us reach more people. It primarily will be triggering the algorithm of the mainstream platforms like reviews on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform, hitting the like button, comments, especially in the archive, sharing links, subscribing, getting notifications. All that stuff is really important. I'm very grateful for any consideration you can give to joining us financially, helping us otherwise, combination, whatever it may be. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for watching or listening to this show. I hope you have an awesome weekend, and I look forward to seeing you next week here on the Path to Liberty.